And here we are back with Heavier Than Heaven. Recorded on April 1st. April Fool's Day to most. Gotta smoke some of that green lettuce on April 1st. Sure as I can say that honestly, it's really sad that this is the very first book that I ever read on Nirvana. And how much they push him as suicidal, depressed son of a gun. No wonder why I thought being depressed and shit like that was a better way to write music. All because the narrative that was pushed that wasn't even Kurt's. And we're back to chapter 8. In high school again. Olympia, Washington, April 1987 through May 1988. Fuck, I'm in high school again. I want to move back to Aberdeen. Escape from a letter. Excerpt from a letter to Dale Grohl. 2 months after the show in Raymond, Kurt took on another significant journey. He once forever lived Aberdeen, and he had spent the first 20 years of his life there, but having left, he'd rarely go back. He packed up his stuff, and what time consisted of little more than a hefty bag of clothes and a crate of albums, and his now empty rat cage, loaded into Tracy's car for a 65-mile trip to Olympia. Though Olympia was only slightly bigger than Aberdeen, it was a college town, the state capital, and one of the freakiest places west of the East Village. With the odd collection of punk rockers, artists, would-be revolutionists, feminists, and just plain old weirdos, students at the Evergreen State College, universally called Greeners, created their own curriculum. Kurt was planning on college, but he at least was at the right age to fit in, and he had to be conflicted with the relationship with the town's artsy crowd, and he yearned for their acceptance, yet frequently felt inadequate. It was a reoccurring theme in his life. Kurt moved to Olympia to live with Tracy in a studio apartment in an old house converted into a threeplex at 1114 Paris Street. It was a tiny, but the rent was only $137.50 a month, including utilities, and the location just a few blocks downtown from the whole deal ideal for Kurt. Just a few blocks from downtown was ideal for Kurt, who rarely had access to an operable vehicle, and for the first month he looked for jobs without much success, while Tracy supported him while working in the cafeteria of the Boeing airplane plant in Seattle. She pulled a graveyard shift, and the commitment meant that she left for work was at 10 o'clock in the evening and didn't arrive home until 9 in the morning. The job did provide a steady income, and something they both knew they couldn't be without. Because of her unusual hours, Tracy began leaving Kurt to-do lists, and the form of communication would turn into a ritual in their relationship. One such list, wrote in 1987, read, "Kurt, sweep the kitchen, behind the cat litter box, garbage can, under cat food, shake mats, put dirty dishes in sink, clean up corner, sweep floor, shake mats." Signed with heart and smiley face. Kurt's note back, "Please set alarm for 11. I will do the dishes then, okay?" At first, Kurt helped with the housework, and doing the dishes and even mopping the floor occasionally, though the apartment was tiny and it needed constant cleaning due to their menagerie of pets, and while the actual inventory would vary over the next 2 years depending on the lifespan, they had 5 cats, 4 rats, a cockatiel, 2 rabbits, and Kurt's turtles. The apartment had a smell with visitors and would often compromise an unfavorably pet shop, but it was the home of sorts. Kurt named theirs Rabbit Stew. He also painted the bathroom blood red and wrote "Red Rum" on the wall, a reference to Stephen King's The Shining. Since Kurt had a tendency to write on the walls and wisely covered most of the rock posters, which turned on the riverside out, so he would have more space to create, the few posters displayed face up were altered in some way. It was as if a huge poster of the Beatles now sported an afro and glasses on Paul McCartney. Above the bed Led Zeppelin poster, to which Kurt added the following prose: Loser, wino, alcoholic, scum, trash, degenerate. Head lice, scabs, infectious pneumonia, diarrhea, vomits, blood. Urine, malfunctioning bowel muscle, arthritis, gangrene, psychotic mental illness, unable to form sentences, expected to fend for himself in a box in the snow. Next is the screed was a drawing with a bottle of a Thunderbird fortified with wine, in the caricature of Iggy Pop. The refrigerator sported a photo collage which he created of images of meat mixed with old medical illustrations of diseased vaginas. He was fascinated by things that were gross, Tracy recalled. And though Kurt himself rarely talked about religion, I think he believed in God, but more in the devil than actually God. Tracy said that there were crosses and other religious artifacts on the wall, and Kurt enjoyed stealing sculptures of the Virgin Mary from a cemetery and painting blood tears under their eyes. Tracy was brought to the Lutheran, and most of their religious discussion is concerned whether God could exist in a world filled with such horror, or with Kurt with the position that Satan was stronger. After a couple of months being a house husband, Kurt took a short-lived job on for $4.75 an hour at the Lenin janitorial service, a small family-run cleaning business. He claimed his friends, and he cleaned doctors' and dentists' office, and he used his occasional steal the drugs. But according to the owner of the business, the route that Kurt worked was mostly industrial buildings with a few chances to steal anything. He used some of what he earned to buy a rusty old Datsun. One thing was certain about his janitorial service, in both ways physical and emotional. It left Kurt with little energy to apply cleaning to his own apartment anymore, which he created the first tension between him and Tracy. Even after he quit the job, he apparently felt like no more cleaning was required of him in his lifetime. In Olympia, his inner artistic life was developing in ways it had never had before. Being unemployed, Kurt set into motion a routine that he would follow for the rest of his life. He would rise around noon, eat a brunch of sorts. Kraft macaroni and cheese was his favorite food. Having tried other brands, his delicate palate had been determined that it came from processed cheese and pasta. Kurt earned its role as the market leader. After eating, he would spend the rest of his day doing one of three things: watching television, which he did unceasingly, practicing his guitar, which he did for hours, usually while watching TV, or creating some kind of art project, be it painting, a collage, a three-dimensional illustration. The last activity was never formal. He rarely identified himself as an artist, yet he spent hours in this manner. He wrote in his journals, through an inlet dialogue he kept, not as much to a play-by-play, but of his day, as a therapeutic obsessive-compulsive device, wherein let loose by his innermost thoughts. The writing was imaginative and many times disturbing. His songs and his journal entries fused together at times, but were both obsessed with the human body functions. Birth, urination, defecation, sexuality were topics he accomplished in. One small segment illustrates the familiar themes that he would revisit again and again. Chef Boyardee is a meaner, stronger, less susceptible to disease, and more dominant than a male gorilla. He comes to me at night, willfully opening the locks and bending the bars of my window, costing me horrendous amounts of money in the home burglary devices. He comes to me in my bedroom, naked, shaved and oiled, goose-pumped, thick black arm hairs risen off the skin, standing in a pool of pizza grease, barfing up flour. It enters my lungs. I cough. He laughs. He mounts me. I'd like to kick his hot, stinking, macho fucking ass. These inner thoughts, many times full of violence, were marked in contrast to Kurt's external world. For the first time, his life had a steady girlfriend who doted on him and saw everything and every one of his needs. At times, the attention Tracy paid him bordered on mothering, and in a way he needed nothing more than mothering. He remarked to his friends that she was the best girlfriend in the world. As a couple, they exhibited signs of domestic tranquility, and they'd walk to the laundromat together, and when they'd afford it, they'd get out and take pizza from the 4th Avenue Tavern. They lived across the door to a different pizza joint, but Kurt insisted it sucked. Kurt enjoyed cooking, and he frequently made Tracy his signature entree, vanilla chicken, or fettuccine alfredo. He'd eat the kind of stuff that they would make other people gain weight, but he never gained any weight, Tracy observed. His size has always been a matter of concern, and he'd write away to ads and buxom magazines for weight-gaining powders, but they had little effect. His hip bones stuck out, and his knobby knees, Tracy recalled. He didn't wear shorts unless it got really hot, because he was so self-conscious about how skinny his legs were. For one trip to the beach, Kurt came dressed in long johns, a pair of Levi's, a second pair of Levi's worn over the first pair, and a long-sleeve shirt, a t-shirt, and 2 sweatshirts. He wanted to make himself look bigger, Tracy said. The one thing in his life that successfully made him feel bigger was his music, and by the summer of 1987 the band was going on strong. They still hadn't had a permanent name and called themselves among everything from Throat Oyster to Ted Ed Fred, and after the boyfriend, Greg Hackinson's mom. They played a couple of parties in late 1987, and in April they even performed on a college radio station, KAOS. And in Olympia, Tracy gave the tape to a radio show to Jim May of Tacoma's Community World Theater at CWT and urged Jim to book them. Tracy and Shelley contributed to the band in those early days in ways that cannot be underestimated. They played informal roles of the press agents, managers, bookers, and merchandise salespeople in addition to their job of making sure the men were fed, dressed, and rehearsed. May gave the band their first non-party gig, for which they played under the name Skid Row. At the time, Kurt was not aware of the little metal band that had formed in New York with the same moniker. It didn't matter. They would change the name for every show, the way that a socialite might try on hats. This performance, though not long after the Raymond party, showed the band was growing in leaps and bounds. Even Tracy, who was biased, since she was in love with the singer, was impressed by how much they had developed, and when they started to play by mouth, they dropped open, and I said, these guys were good. They may have sounded good, but they certainly looked strange for the gig. Kurt had attempted to be glam. He wore, as what many did that same year, flare pants, a silk Hawaiian shirt, and 4-inch platform shoes, to look taller. Musician John Pukey had attempted at CW that night, despite their strange attire, recalled, being blown away. I heard this person's voice singing and it completely impressed me. I'd never heard a voice like his before. It was very distinct. And there was the one song, Love Buzz, that definitely stuck out. Love Buzz had been the one missing piece the band needed, and Chris had discovered the song on an album by a Dutch band called The Shocking Blue, and Kurt embraced it immediately and made it their signature tune. It began with a mild tempo drum beat, but quickly transitioned into a whirling guitar riff, and the performance of the song mixed with the equal parts of psychedelic trance and with the thudding, slowed-down heaviness from Chris' bass part. Kurt would play the guitar solo on the back on the floor. They began to play regularly on CWT. Though not to suggest that they built an audience there would be an exaggeration. The theater itself was a former porno theater, and the only source of heat was a propane blower that ran loudly even during the band's sets. Kurt commented that there had even been a present smell of urine in the place, and most of the crowd at the early shows came there to see the groups the night before. Kurt played the lineup that was Bleeder, Panic, and Lethal Dose. Jim booked those guys and then booked nobody else, and nobody else would touch them, explained Buzz Osborne. It was as if they cut their milk teeth. Kurt was always learning from Buzz, and realized that even a gig in front of their friends was a chance to grow. I could count on them to play any time, remembered May. Kurt would never take any money, which was also good for me because I was only doing about 12 shows a month, and only 2 would make money. Kurt had wisely sized up this situation and realized the band would get more gigs and more experience if they played for free. And what did they need money for anyway? They had Tracy and Shelley. Shelley had taken a job alongside Tracy in the Boeing cafeteria, and Shelley had taken a job alongside Tracy at the Boeing cafeteria, and she and Chris had moved into an apartment in Tacoma, 30 miles north of Olympia. With the move, the band briefly fell apart. Previously, Chris and Aaron both living in Aberdeen area. Kurt would take the bus back to rehearsals. But with Chris in Tacoma, and working 2 jobs at Sears and the industrial painter. The only one who seemed to have time for the band was Kurt. He wrote Chris a letter to talk to him back into the group. It was funny. It was like a commercial, Chris remembered. It said, "Come join the band, no commitment, no obligation." So I called him and said, "Yeah, let's do it again." And what we did was we built a rehearsal space down in the basement of our house, and we cruised construction sites, and we took scraps and built what would be a 2x4s and old carpet, and Kurt had been friends for some time, and seconds forming the band would be a cement in their relationship in deeper ways. Though neither was particularly good at talking about their emotions, they forged a brotherly bond that seemed to grow stronger over all other relationships in their lives. But even with the coma rehearsal spot as of 1987 went down, they again faced the drummer problem, which plagued them for the next 4 years. Buckhart still lived in Grays Harbor, and with the new job, an assistant manager in Aberdeen Burger King, he couldn't play with anyone anymore. In response, Kurt placed a Musicians Wanted ad. In October 1987, the Rocket and Serious Drummers wanted underground, Black Flag, Melvins, Led Zeppelin, Scratch Acid, Ethel Merman, Versatile as Heck, Kurt 32520992. They found no serious takers. So as by December, Kurt and Chris began to practice with Dale Crover, who was back from California, and they began to talk about making a demo. During 1987, Kurt had dozens of songs, and he was yearning to record them. He saw an ad for a Reciprocal Studio, which charged only $20 an hour for recording, and booked January session with an up-and-coming producer, Jack Endino. Endino had no idea that Kurt was, as he wrote, Kurt Cobain, down in the schedule. On January 23, 1988, a friend, Chris of Nocelix, drove the band and all their gear up to Seattle, with the shingle-covered camper, heated by a wood stove, and it looked like a backwoods shack deposited on a pickup, which it was. Driving into the big city, they looked like the Beverly Hillbillies, with the wood smoke coming out the back of the camper. Their truck was so overweight, it scraped against the road as it drove. Reciprocal was run by Chris Hazenseck, with Endino, Mudhoney, Soundgarden, and Mother Lovebone had all worked there. It was already legendary by 1988, and the studio itself was 900 square feet, with a control room so tiny that the people could not comfortably stand in it at once. The 3 people could not stand in it comfortably at once. The carpets were well worn, the door frames were all coming apart, and tacked back to a few times in its age, recalled Hazenseck. You could see the place, with the signs of 10,000 musicians who had rubbed their elbows against the place. Yet to Kurt and Chris, this was exactly the place that they were seeking. As much as wanting a demo tape, they had sought the same league as these other bands. They quickly dispensed with inductions and went into recording. It's crazy because I've been talking to Jack and Dino, and I can totally see this place in my head, just the picture of the place. It's on a corner of a street. It's just tiny as hell. It's amazing that there's even a building on the corner of this particular street. And they have a recording studio there. Almost immediately, in less than 6 hours, as they recorded and mixed 9.5 songs, the last tune, Pen Cap Chew, was incomplete. And as the reel of tape ran out during the recording, the band didn't want to front an additional $30 for another tape reel. And Dino was impressed by the band, not overly so. At the end of the day, Kurt paid for the $152.44 with cash, money he had saved working at his janitor job. The camper then was reloaded with equipment, and the band headed south. On this day, as they had shown a schedule at the Tacoma Comedy World Theater, during the hour's drive they had listened to their demos twice. The 10 songs were in order: If You Must, Downer, Floyd the Barber, Paper Cuts, Spank Through, Hairspray Queen, Aero Zeppelin, and Beeswax, Mexican Seafood, and half of Pen Cap Chew. When the time came for their set, they played the same 10 songs in order. It was the day of triumphs for Kurt, and his first day as a real musician. He had been to a studio in Seattle, and he had played another show in front of a adoring crowd of 20. Dave Foster was in another band on the bill that night and recalled the performance as particularly inspired. They were great. Crover was killer, and though he had a hard time hearing him above the propane blower, since it was really cold that night. Backstage, an incident came up that would mark the night in ways that Kurt had anticipated. Compared to Chris and Kurt, Grover was a veteran, and he and the Melvins had played the CDW several times. He asked Kurt how much they were making for the gig, and when Kurt told him that they were doing it for nothing, Grover protested. May explained that he tried to pay the band for their last few gigs. Grover protested, and May explained that he tried to pay the band for the last few gigs, and the club was finally doing a little better. But Kurt continued to refuse to take the money, and Grover started yelling, and until Kurt finally announced, "We're not taking any money," Kroger argued that even if they pay, would only be a paltry $20. There was a principle at stake. "You should never do this, Kurt. These guys are just screwing you. You'll always get screwed. You've got to get your money." But Kurt and Chris really saw the reality of May's situation, and May finally came up with a compromise, and that would keep Kurt in his integrity and make Grover happy. He convinced the band to take $10 for gas, and Kurt put the $10 bill in his pocket and said thanks. He left the club that night for the first time in his life as a professional musician, fingering the bill all the way home. $10, that's crazy. I feel crazy as a kid that I never played anything that light. I think the cheapest bill that I ever fronted would have been $75, and there was a whole shitload of tips. But damn, he'd play for free. It really teaches me something. A month later, Kurt celebrated his 21st birthday and finally experiencing the American rite of passage that's meant that he could finally buy liquor. He and Tracy got drunk this one time. Kurt bought pizza and had a relationship with alcohol that was on and off again, flirtation. Being with Tracy, he was drinking less and doing fewer drugs than in his Aberdeen shack days. None of his friends remember him being the most intoxicated of the group. That distinction usually fell on Chris or Dylan Carlson, who by then was living next door to Kurt on Pear Street, and at times Kurt seemed downright temperate. Their other neighbor, Matthew Slim Moon, had stopped drinking 2 years previously, and there were examples of sobriety around Kurt, and his poverty during the 1988 meant that he could barely afford food, so a luxury like alcohol was saved for a celebration or when he could raid somebody else's fridge. At a time when he turned 21, Kurt had temporarily quit smoking and was adamant about people not lighting up around him. He signed a note to a friend that year saying, "The stuck-up rock star who bitches about exhaust fumes." He felt like smoking harmed his singing voice and his health, and Kurt was always a strange mixture of self-preservation and self-destruction, and meeting him one night, you might hardly imagine he was the same person if you encountered him 2 weeks later. "We once went to a party in Tacoma," Tracy remembered, and the next morning he was asking me what he did because he got really drunk, and I told him that he smoked a cigarette, and he was shocked. His sister Kim visited around the time that Kurt was 21, and they had bonded in some ways and they hadn't done for years, recounting that they shared their childhood traumas. "He ripped me on the Long Island iced tea at his house," Kim recalled. "I got sick, but it was a fun time." By 1988, Kurt stopped drinking before shows. His focus was always on the band, and to the exclusion of everything else, and at 21, he was serious about music, as he ever would be. He lived, slept, breathed the band. Even before the band had a permanent name, Kurt was convinced that getting a video on MTV was their ticket to fame, and to this end, Kurt convinced the band to play the Aberdeen Radio Shack, while a friend shot the performance on a low-rent video camera using multiple special effects. And when Kurt watched the complete tape, he then realized it looked more like amateurs pretending to be rock stars than professional musicians. Soon after the Radio Shack appearance, Grover left the band's employ to go back to California with the Melvins. They had always known that Grover was the only temporary solution to their drummer problem, and the Melvins' exodus was indicative of what many of the Northwest bands at the time believed. It had been long since the Northwest group had been broken through, and Heart had been in some ways the last big success. That move to a more populous center seemed to be the only road to fame. Losing Grover added to Kurt's frustration, but it also helped him find the identity of his own, and his group to be thought of as something other than the Melvins afoot. As the mid-1980s, more people of Olympia knew the Kurt as a roadie for the Melvins than a leader of his own band. That was about to change. Crover had recommended Dave Foster and a hard-pounding, hard-living Aberdeen drummer. Though a drummer back in Grays Harbor remained a logistical problem, by this time Kurt had his Datsun to help. When it was running, which was infrequently, he would drive to Aberdeen to pick Foster up, take him to Tacoma for his practice, then reverse the whole route later, that night or the morning, putting in hours of driving. Their first show with Foster was at a party in Olympia house, nicknamed the Caddy Shack. One of Olympia's eccentricities was that every student household in the 80s had some one of its kind of nickname. The Caddy Shack was near a golf course, and other than the radio show on KOAS and the Brown Cow show at the Gesco, this was Kurt's first public performance in Olympia that would be the first part of a painful growth curve. Playing it to a living room full of college students, it was a cultural shock, and Kurt had attempted to dress the part. He wore the ripped-up jean jacket with the tapestry in The Last Supper and sewed on the back with the plastic monkey Chim Chim from the Speed Racer cartoon. Glued to the epaulette of the Foster wore a t-shirt, stonewashed jeans with a mustache, and before the band had even begun with the kid with the mohawk haircut, grabbed a microphone and yelled, "Drummers from Aberdeen look weird." Though it was the Foster kid that was criticizing the comment cut, and to Kurt as well, he wanted nothing more than to be thought of the Olympia sophisticate, and not an Aberdeen hick. Classism would be a fight that he would struggle with his entire life, because no matter how far he got from the Grays Harbor, he left as a branded hillbilly, and most of the greeners from the big cities, like many of the privileged college kids, their prejudice toward people from the rural communities was marked on the contrast to the liberalism they professed towards different races, and the Caddyshack gig was almost a year to one day after the Raymond party, and it found that Kurt in the paradigm that he hadn't expected. His band's too hip for Raymond, but here in Olympia they weren't hip enough. He discussed with his bandmates, hoping as if they looked more sophisticated and that they would be taken more seriously. Kurt ordered Foster to cut his drum kit down from 12 pieces to 6, and then he started Foster's appearance. "You gotta get with it, Dave." Dave angrily replied, "It's not fair to make fun of me as a short-haired guy. I've got a job. We could have green hair and we'd still look like hicks." Despite the fact that he'd say the exact opposite to interviews, Kurt cared very much about what people thought of him. If that meant to get rid of his stonewashed jean jacket with the white fleece collar, which now was in the closet of his apartment, so be it. Foster's dress, other than the mustache, was so different from Kurt's 2 years before, which may be why Kurt took the criticism so personally. Kurt discovered that the punk rock, despite the build of the liberating genre of music, came from his own social mores and styles, and that these were many more times constricting than the conventions that they were supposedly in rebellion against. There was a dress code, and perhaps in some small attempt to leave behind the past, this associations the band had with Aberdeen came up with one final name for the group, and Foster first heard the name when he saw the flyer at Kurt's house for Nirvana. "Who's that?" he asked. "That's us," Kurt replied. "It's an attainment of perfection, and in Buddhism, Nirvana is the place reached when one transcends to the endless cycle of rebirth and human suffering. By renouncing desire and following the eightfold path through meditation and spiritual practice, worshippers work to achieve Nirvana and thus gain the release from the path of life." Kurt, considering himself a Buddhist at the time, though his only practice of this faith was having watched a late-night television program, it would be under the name Nirvana that the band would first gain the attention in Seattle, a city population of 500,000 where Kurt was convinced that the Last Supper jacket would fit right in. Jack and Dino had remixed the January 23rd session on cassette, and then he passed on to a few of his friends. One went to Don Anderson, who worked for The Rocket, ran a fanzine, Backlash, and another Shirley Carlson, who was a volunteer of the DJ on KMMCU, the University of Washington radio station, and the third he passed on was Jonathan Poneman, co-owner of Sub Pop Records, Northwest independent record label. All three cassettes would impact Nirvana's future. Anderson liked the cassette enough that she planned on an article Carlson aired the Floyd the Biber on KMCU, and he phoned Kurt and was with their visiting Dale Crover. It was a conversation that Kurt had been waiting for his whole life and would later be the recast of these events and suggest fame without any prodding on his part, and he could be the further from the truth. The instant that he received the demo, he began dubbing off copies and mailing them to the record labels, and on the contrary, shopping for a deal. He sent the long handwritten letters to every record label that he could think of, and the fact that he hadn't thought of Sub Pop was the only indication that the label of the label's lowly status. Kurt was the most interested in being an SST or Touch and Go. Greg Ginn was one of the owners of SST and a member of the band like Black Flag. Remembered getting an early demo tape in the mail. My optimists on them, and they were not that original. They were there by the numbers, and Kurt sent dozens of demos to Touch and Go during 1988, and he'd even gone as far as to title the songs Touch and Go demos. In his notebook, the tape made so little impression that no one on the label remembered receiving them. The tape made a bigger splash with Poneman, who took the cassette, to his partner Bruce Pavitt at his day job at Muzak Corporations, the elevator music company. The Muzak tape duplicating room was strangely the day job of choice for many of the members of the Seattle rock elite, and Poneman was auditioned for the tape for those presenting, including Mark Arm of Mudhoney. They gave it in the thumbs down, when Arm dismissing it as similar to Skin Yard, but not as good. Still, Poneman was able to schedule Nirvana on the bottom bill and a small Seattle band called Vogue for one of the label's monthly Sub Pop Sunday showcases. There was a $2 cover showcases featured 3 bands, and though the beer specials were a big part of the draw to the music, Poneman asked if Nirvana could play, and the Vogue on Sunday of April, Kurt was trying not to sound too enthusiastic, quickly said yes. Here we are in April. The Vogue was a tiny club on Seattle, in First Avenue, best known for its transvestite bar. In a previous life, it had briefly been a new wave club, before the gay biker bar. In 1988, the biggest draw was Disco Night, lower of beer specials with a 3-bottle of beer for $3 in the Regard. The Vogue was reflected generally in a poor state of the Seattle club scene at the time, and where a few places of the original bands were able to play, as Pavitt wrote in The Rocket in December of 1987, despite the desperate lack of a good club, Seattle has rarely seen so many bands. The Vogue didn't have a strong pea smell like the Community World Theater did, but it did have a faint odor of vanilla, and a remnant from many amyl nitrate poppers smashed on the floor during dance night. Nonetheless, Kurt Cobain couldn't wait to get on the stage. Like a senior citizen going to a dentist appointment, the band made sure that they were there for all its important shows. Arriving 4 hours before showtime, having nothing to do, knowing a few people in the city, they drove aimlessly, but for soundcheck, Kurt puked in the parking lot next to the venue. It was only because he was nervous, remembered Foster. He wasn't drinking. And before their call, they had to wait in the van, and since Foster was underage. What a fucker, that had to suck. Why would you have somebody underage in the band? When it came time to play, Kurt became, by Foster's description, pretty uptight. And when they got on stage, they were surprised to see the audience was just as small as their usual CDW shows. There was hardly anyone there, remembered DJ Shirley Carlson. The few people that all knew Tracy or Kurt from the parties had already heard the tape, and we didn't even know who sang. At best, it was a lackluster performance, and we didn't really fuck up, Foster recalled. Like we didn't have to stop in the middle of a song, but it was very intimidating because we knew it was for getting a record deal. They played 14 songs with no encore, and beginning with Love Buzz, which was the usual at the time. Kurt thought that it was wise to put their best material first, and in case people left. Some of the audience did leave, and Carlson was one of the few people, if anything, good to say about the band, comparing them to the Cheap Trick, and I remember thinking that only one could think that Kurt could sing and play guitar, though together, not very well. but he had remarkably a Robin Zander-like voice, and many of the members of the Seattle rock establishment thought that the band stank. Photographer Charles Peterson was so unimpressed that he didn't want to waste any film on them, and questioned Poneman about the wisdom of signing the group. Perhaps the harshest critic to the band's performance, as always, was Kurt himself. When a photographer, Rich Hansen, photographed the band after the show, Kurt was now nursing a drink and shouted, "We sucked." They were very self-critical of their set, Hansen recalled, and there seemed to be some discussion of them missing some chords. I was struck by how very green they were. There was also an absolute naiveness about them. Hansen's pictures from that night give much of the insight of the freak show appearance of the group. Chris was 6'7" and appears as a giant next to Kurt, and Foster, he has long sideburns and curly medium-length hair. Foster is a 5'5", reaches to Chris' breasts, and wears the kind of outfit that you can imagine Kurt lecturing him on. Stonewashed jeans and a white t-shirt, and a mountain silhouette silk screen, and a backward baseball cap, a Corona beer logo. He was also off looking into the distance, perhaps remembering that he has no work by 7 in the morning, and Kurt, who has Hansen convinced to sit on Chris' knee for some of the frames, wears jeans, a gray sweatshirt turned inside out, and a dark shirt and a dark sweater. His blonde hair has grown to the length of 3 inches below his shoulder, and with the 5-day beard, he bears a striking resemblance to the portrayed Jesus Christ figure. Even Kurt's impression in one of the photos painted a faraway look. It was as if he was marking his own moment in time, as if a similar image of Christ to Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper. On the ride home, Kurt discussed the show as their first real setback, and vowed that they'd never be so embarrassed again. It was as if 4 in the morning before they were to reach their homes, and on the long drive Kurt pledged to his bandmates and himself that he would practice a lot more and write new songs, and they would no longer suck. But when Poneman called a couple of days later and suggested they do a record together, suddenly Kurt's own recollections of the show shifted. 2 weeks later, Kurt wrote to Dale Crover, titling it, "Oh, our final name is Nirvana." The purpose of this letter is to both brag and to seek advice. It was one of the many letters that he wrote that he never sent, and it consents to describe in detail parts of the night that he was choosing to remember and plans to be chosen to not forget and reconstruct in his own liking. He wrote, in full, "So within the last couple of months, our demo has been pirated, recorded, and discussed between the Seattle scene of luminaries. And the dude Jonathan Poneman, remember the guy who called me when you were over the other last day? Mr. Big Money Inheritance, right-hand man of Bruce Abbott, the Sub Pop Records financial investor, got us a show at the Vogue on Sunday at Sub Pop. Big deal. But I guess the hype and regularity to playing at KMCU probably helped. The amount of people who came to judge us, not to be at the bar to get drunk, watch because some of the bands have fun, but not just to watch us showcase the event 1 hour. There was a representative from every Seattle band there just watching, and we felt like we should have scorecards. Or so after the set, Bruce excitedly shakes our hand and says, good job, let's do a record." Then flashes the cameras go off, and the girls in the backlash says, "Gee, can we do an interview?" "Yeah, sure, why not?" And then the people say, "You guys are doing a really great job, and you guys are really great now, and we expected to be the total socialites, meeting people and introducing, etc. Fuck, I'm in a high school again. I want to move back to Aberdeen, not Olympia. It's just as boring as I can proudly say. I've only been on the Smithfield's Cafe about 5 times this year, and because of the zoo event, we've at least gotten a contract for a 3-song single to be put out by the end of August and an EP in September or October. We're going to try to talk into an LP, and now Jonathan is one of our managers. He gets our shows remotely in Oregon and Vancouver, and he's paying for all the recording and distribution costs. And now we don't have out to rigorous phone bills. Dave is working out okay. Sometime this year, Sub Pop is going to have a caravan, or 2 or 3 of Seattle's bands go on tour, and yeah, we'll see. Through your past experiences, do you think it would be wise to demand receipts for recording and pressing costs? Though about records, except this one in last month, Chris and I dropped acid and we were watching the last show. rip-off of Johnny Carson and Paul Revere, and the Raiders were on, and they were so fucking stupid, dancing around with their mustaches and trying to act comical and goofy. And if they really pissed us off, I asked Chris, do you have any Paul Revere and Raiders albums? Even in the early stages of his career, Kurt had already begun the process of retelling his own story in the manner of a formed separate self. He was commencing his creations in his greatest character of the mythical Kurt Cobain, and he even misspelled his name. He would bring out his carefully refined phantom when he needed to distance himself from his own actions and his own circumstances, and he exaggerated every aspect of a show, and his own admission as such sucked. The crowd, too, was small for the flashes and mostly the metaphorical, since Hansen was only shot a couple of frames. In describing Sub Pop's honchos and coming to him, Kurt even attempts to portray himself as an unwilling participant in his own success, but he was now a novice actor, and at this point he admits he had planned to talk to Sub Pop into a full-length record. It was worth noting that virtually every business expectation Kurt and Sub Pop, at least in short term, went unfulfilled. Imagine that. They're still even in business to this day because of Nirvana. I don't even think there would be a Sub Pop if there wasn't for Nirvana and the fact that they got to attach themselves to the Nevermind album. Because they weren't out of their contract to Sub Pop yet. Anyways, that's the end of Chapter 8. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and check out Love Kills if you even got the time.